This is the first lecture of the Discovering the Grid module, covering what is layout for the ART159 graphic design layout class. So the question that we're going to be asking and talking about within this lecture is, what is layout and how can we use that within design? Well, graphic design layout refers to the way in which we arrange the elements on a page, which makes up the content of a design. So the aim of a layout is both to convey the message correctly, but also to present that information in a logical and coherent way and make sure that the most important elements of that design are going to stand out. Again, that goes back to the hierarchy within your design. What individuals are going to look at first, second, and third, and how you can control that within your own design. Now, this is an example here of a simple organization of information, but it has this clear structure to it. Entering into this space, we can clearly see that there are some examples of the principles that we have discussed in the previous lecture of contrast within the different colors and the sizing, the repetition in the space, potentially with the type of text that is being used, at least with the sizing of the lines that are showing that text within the mock-up. As well as alignment of these elements within the text and the images and the additional content. And then the proximity, how you are placing this information together, what belongs together, and what can be separated from one another as well. So let's think about this in terms of a classic newspaper. We are all familiar with that sort of structure of these justified columns of text. And these are designed to be visually appealing, but at the same time, they're designed to be authoritative. So the use of these large sort of headlines grabs the reader's attention, and the subheaders, the smaller areas of text below that, allow you to see an obvious hierarchy of information, meaning you can easily get the gist of the news without needing to necessarily read the entire article or get into the actual body copy. There's sort of these stepping stones as a reader that you are being enticed to try to read the entire article. So giving you the headline, then a little bit more information with that subheader in hopes that you will find that information interesting enough to read the rest of the article. And this can be done, this can be seen both in a printed format like we see over here on the left, or in a digital format like we can see over here on the right. Same principles apply. So layout basically means the arrangement of these predetermined items, such as images, text, and other styles that are on a page. And it establishes this overall appearance and the relationships between these graphic elements to achieve this smooth flow of your message and create an eye movement of maximum effectiveness or impact. Now, within our layouts, we're going to be talking about grids. And what is a grid? Well, grids are a useful tool within layout design because they help to structure and organize the content. Design elements are arranged in a sort of grid in order to create a layout that feels cohesive. Now, looking at the examples that we can see here, we can see that there are a variety of these images of the streets from different areas of the world here. We see Barcelona, Copenhagen, Paris, San Francisco, so on and so forth. Now, if you've ever been to Europe, maybe to Rome or even to Copenhagen, for example, you might know that it's a little bit more difficult to navigate those sort of cities due to the grid structure of how these buildings are put in place. Something like Rome, compared to New York, is very, very organic in its approach compared to the very, very structured sort of columns and rows that we start to see in New York. And if you've ever traveled to New York, you know that it is actually fairly simple to navigate as far as taking a left, a right, going straight will pretty much get you in the direction that you need to go. That's not always necessarily the case when you look at some of these other cities. And essentially, this is the grid of the actual city, how these were being laid out. Now, a place like Rome was not necessarily considered from the very beginning of how this layout was going to be orchestrated. So it started in a central area and slowly started to expand from that central area. So they would slowly build out from there and try to make the organization work within the real estate that they had. On the other hand, an area like New York or even Toronto was very well thought out and orchestrated in that construction, and that grid was created on purpose within the infrastructure of that particular city. We can also see this being applied to things like an Egyptian grid system, or the development of the Egyptian grid system, to start to see about proportions of the human body and how they were using this grid to create those sort of relationships and be able to establish some sort of measurements for those. Or this overhead of a Colosseum structure that we can see that would have all of these different pillars that would be holding up the actual building along here on the bottom. These were not just randomly placed. They are in a very, very specific spot that creates this very justified sort of area here that positions all of these columns in this strict grid that we can see. So the benefit of grids is that they can help to create a balanced and organized layout. And this makes the content flow more intuitively, and in turn it creates a better user experience. Although grids are invisible to the user-facing design, it's easy to tell at a glance whether a layout follows some sort of grid system, or at least includes some sort of guidelines to align the different elements of the design in the layout. Now, what we were talking about there is that, again, the grid is invisible to the user. We do not leave the grid visible for users to see typically. This is something we as designers use to place these elements, and then we remove the grid and the alignment will remain within all of those different elements. And there are different styles of grids as well. We can see 4 different examples here: the block grid, a column grid, a modular grid, and then a hierarchical grid. There are others beyond this, but these are just 4 basics that we are going to begin to look at here within this class. The main anatomical elements of a grid system are things that we are going to be talking about throughout the entirety of this class, and will also be on the final exam in this class. So it's very important to have a clear understanding of the terminology that we use when we are referring to a grid and a layout. As you can see here, there are different elements such as margins, columns, modules, spatial zones, flow lines, markers, gutters, alleys, and fields. And all of these have very specific purposes within your design layout. And we're going to look at each one of these one by one. So the first thing we're going to look at is margins. Margins are the borders or the negative spaces located between the edge of the page and the compositional layout that define what we refer to as the live area. The live area is where all of your design elements are going to be placed within that specific page. So this means things like images and type that reside within the actual grid. So here you can see in these sort of yellow striped areas what the margins of this page are. Now this is, again, just an example, but one thing that you might notice is that these margins are not all the same exact size. The top margin and the side margin are approximately the same width, but the right-hand margin is slightly wider, and the bottom margin is slightly larger than that. So margins can be different sizes within the page, but the margins determine the live area, again, this white area here of your design, where all of your important design elements are intended to be. The next thing that we're going to look at is columns. And columns are going to be the vertical alignments of type that create vertical divisions between the live area of a compositional layout's margins. So we can see here these columns that are being used in the space to define these vertical spaces within that live area. Notice how these are only within the live area and do not go all the way out into the margins. These are contained within, and they are separated here between as well. Now, one easy way to remember these is going back to the term of what we refer to as columns in architecture, which is what we use to hold up different buildings. So that's an easy way to remember that, as these vertical sort of structures that hold up our layouts as well, or define our layouts. Next, we're going to look at modules. Modules are going to be individual units of space within a grid separated by regular intervals, which when repeated across a page layout, create columns and rows of varying sizes. So here we can see an actual margin, a module. So from the column and the row, which we're going to talk about in a second, these different modules are created. And we've talked about this within the previous lecture as well in the grids and modularity. Within a grid, there are different modules, and you can group those modules together to create what we refer to as the spatial zones. Spatial zones are going to be the groups of modules in a grid system that form distinct fields for containing and displaying similar information in a consistent manner, such as groups of images or multiple columns of text. So again, going back to the grids and modularity project, you are looking at how you can start to define these different modules and group them together to create these spatial zones where you might place larger images or larger bodies of text. Now again, remember, you do not want these modules to go into the gutter unless it's going to go all the way into the gutter and into the other module and fill that up completely. The gutters should otherwise be left empty to define those different modules within the space. Flow lines are used to organize visual and narrative content into defined areas within or outside the grid structure. So it can be used to align elements and organize the space outside of that grid structure or potentially outside of your live area as well. This is an example of a flow line. This is being taken out of the actual grid structure and added to it to, again, create some sort of consistency or alignment, maybe within additional elements that are needed within that. We also have markers. Markers are going to be placement indicators in a grid system for supporting page information, such as running headers or running footers, folios or page numbers, or any other repeating element that occupies a consistent location on a page, layout, or a spread. So here you can see within the margin, we have this marker. And again, this is intended to live from spread to page to page. So think, for example, a magazine that might have some sort of navigation in that magazine telling you what page number you're on, what the magazine title is, what the actual article that you are reading within that magazine is. Most of those are going to be found within these different markers, typically within the footer or the header of the layout. And that is because within this margin, you know that this is outside of your live area and that this can be repeated from page to page without interfering with any of the information that you do have within your live area. That's why these are typically going to sit in the blank areas of the margins. Another thing that we're going to speak about here is a gutter or an alley. So a gutter is traditionally considered an inactive space on a page grid, needed either as an internal edge for binding or to separate columns of running text or rows for that matter. A central gutter or alley is the central margin of a grid where two pages meet at the spine. So for example, we can see here that a gutter is separating these different columns within the space and the different modules within the space, both vertically and horizontally here, right? Now, we also have alleys, which are going to be at the edge of the page where your book would be bound together to create a full spread. Again, thinking in terms of a magazine, that center alley would be where the magazine comes together to fold. So typically you want to keep any important information out of that alley because of that fold. So this is an example here of a modular layout that we can see. And this is on the left showing all of the different modules that are sitting within the live area. So we have a clear margin that is separating both of these pages, and we see that we have page 1 and page 2. And when we have two facing pages like this, we refer to this as a spread, like a magazine spread. So within this spread, we have clear margins all the way around. We have some sort of markers that are sitting outside of that. We have these different columns and rows that are moving horizontally. Those are all separated by different gutters within the space, and those create this modular grid, individual modules. So by grouping together different modules, like we can see over here on the right, we can take that same grid and start to create spaces where we might include larger images or longer columns of text or larger areas of text by grouping these different modules together. Again, we are still respecting these gutters within this space to create that separation from the content, but we can take different modules and simply group them together to create these different spatial zones. And that is what you're going to be practicing with this week as well. This is just another example here of how you can take a single modular grid and have the same information and place it in a variety of ways using that grid. On both of these pages, you can see that it is the same content with one additional photo over here on the left. But this is actually a modular grid that has 4 columns and 4 rows, and an image or a text block can occupy one or more of those modules, like we can see. This image is taking up 1 module each, with the text box creating a spatial zone of 6 different modules. Over here on the right, we can see that the image is actually taking up 3 modules up at the top, and the text boxes are being broken into 2 different larger columns within this space. So they are grouping together 4 modules in each one of these text boxes, separating them in the middle by this gutter and creating 2 columns of text versus 1 text box like we can see over here on the left. And again, there's endless variations that are possible within this grid system. Now, there are plenty of examples to look at on the internet and in your different books and things like that that you can start to think about. And as you are going to go through and start to look at and define grids that are being used in designs that you find, it's also important to start to think about what style of grid they are using. Now, an example here is the cover from a magazine that pretty much tells us that we are using a grid with approximately 4 columns potentially. We can see that there's one on the left and one on the right. And then we can see that this is being grouped together here, but then it's being separated down below again within those different columns. So more than likely, there's about 4 columns within this design. If we come to the interior of this book, we can see that this is the same grid structure, but now this is being changed to 3 different columns within the space. The image is spanning this spatial zone, taking up 2 of the columns, and the text boxes are sitting in the 3 different columns that we can see. Same magazine, same layout. Moving on to the next spread, we can see this repetition of the 3 different columns with one large image taking up a very large spatial zone there. And then on the last spread, it goes back to a 2 column, right? So how would that be possible? How can we go from a 3 column, or actually starting with a 4 column, going to a 3 column, and then into a 2 column? Well, what happens is oftentimes a grid is a little bit more robust than what we can actually see visually. And this grid that we were actually looking at is actually using a 12-column grid. So there are actually 12 columns within that allows for variations to break this up into, say, 3 different columns, or 2 different columns, or 4 different columns within this space, determining how you are using those different spatial zones and those different modules. So even though it may look like a single simplified grid is being used, oftentimes there's a much larger, robust grid that the design is being based on. And again, that just creates a lot of versatility within the different layouts that you are able to use within your design. Imagine going through a magazine and it's the same exact layout from page to page to page. It would start to get boring. So there's a fine line between using too complicated of a grid and using too simple of a grid as well. You want to try to find that balance where you have variation and ways to push the design from page to page. And it really depends on the project and how many pages you're going to be working on, how much diversity you need within that design. So for this project, please refer to the tutorial that is in the module. You are going to be looking at different layout designs, and you are going to be discovering the style of grid that they used within that design and recreating that within InDesign using placeholder boxes to define where those grids and those columns are being used, as well as defining the different areas of the layout, including the margins, the spatial zones, the columns, and any sort of markers that might be included on here as well. This is an example of a 1-page layout, and you will also be working with a 2-page layout for this as well. So again, please refer back to the modules to the module here within Canvas. And as always, please reach out if you have any questions.